Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Bob Kealing, the author of Good Day, Sunshine State, How the Beatles Rocked Florida. He's written 5 books, and the best part about him, if I may say, is he's a former local news reporter who has won numerous awards for his work at WESH TV in Orlando. I'm a local news reporter, so Bob, it is great to have you for a number of reasons today.
Oh, well, thanks, Evan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity that promotes children's literacy. 79 days between November 22nd, 1963 and February 9th, 1964, the day Kennedy was shot and the day the Beatles came to America. The appearance on the first Ed Sullivan Show has been well documented and is considered a turning point in American, and if not world, history. I've certainly heard about it from my Beatles-obsessed parents for many decades now. My mom's dad complained about their haircuts at the time, as probably lots of dads did back then. So, Bob, what about their show in Miami a week later after that first Ed Sullivan appearance was important? It was their fourth performance in America, and the crowds were still absolutely wild. Your descriptions in the book are unbelievable. So how much of that visceral reaction that we see in the footage of them coming to Miami is a result of the doldrums the nation had been through?
Oh, I think it's a very direct result. And that's not just me saying that. I was fortunate enough to interview the entire team that was responsible for that iconic Life magazine cover where you see the Beatles bobbing in the swimming pool in the home on Biscayne Bay. And the reporter who made all of that happen, Gail Cameron, actually had been at ground zero of Camelot, covering the Kennedys for Life magazine. In fact, she told me this wonderful story about being with Jackie at their home in Hyannis as the 1960 election returns are coming back. And it's just a couple gals hanging out. You know, it's not all these satellite network TV.
Right.
You know, so this is a woman who knew what she was talking about when it came to the shattering impact that this assassination had. And I just found it very compelling in the sense that she said when she covered the Beatles, and they immediately, they were very prescient. They realized what an impact it was having on society and culture. And she said, hearing their music, it was like we were being given permission to smile again. You know, there was joy at Christmas, thankfully, after this awful series of events that happened right around Thanksgiving in 1963. So that's one of many reasons the Beatles hit in America at just the right time.
I've heard a million times, and we've seen the footage of the first Ed Sullivan appearance. But I didn't know that just a week later they were in Miami. So what is the fact that the Miami visit was overshadowed and has been overshadowed for so many decades? What does that reveal about Florida's place in America at the time?
Well, it's, you know, it came in second, you know, and all the great events, all the contests, World Series, Super Bowl, whoever remembers who comes in second, right? But I would argue that it's important for myriad reasons. Number one, for the first time, the Beatles come to a place with beaches and palm trees and sunshine, and they're getting away from being prisoners in a snowbound train or, you know, the Plaza Hotel in New York. I argue that they fall in love with America the first time they visit Florida. They're seeing the real America. And in terms of this second appearance at the Deauville Hotel, live from a working beach resort, the degree of difficulty was so much higher. Can you imagine if you're staying at a hotel and, by the way, in the right next to the buffet that they're going to have for dinner, it's this group, the Beatles is going to be in a nationwide live broadcast. So there's a lot of reasons why I actually call it the second first. It was the most difficult live broadcast perhaps the Beatles ever did. And there was a real payoff. After all, it had the same remarkable ratings as the first live appearance, and it put them up in the rarefied air with the number one show of the day, which was the Beverly Hillbillies.
They appeared to be having a really good time in Florida. You can see pictures and video of them on the beach and looking up from, I think, the hotel pool. There were clearly some young ladies around. This was an exposure that even folks who had clearly been around the block at least a few times at that point, they had done millions of shows or hundreds of shows in Britain by that point. But this was new for them and they loved it.
Yeah. And Evan, I think you're absolutely right. And don't forget too, I mean, these guys were a very tight band. They had been on stage together for hundreds and hundreds of hours. Remember, they played these awful dive bars in Hamburg along the Reeperbahn, and they slept in these awful, like, flophouse conditions. So just imagine the juxtaposition of being the first British band to come to America and be embraced like this. Remember, when they arrived in Florida, number one single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, number one record, Meet the Beatles. They were on top of the world. Oh, and yeah, by the way, the beautiful, curvaceous women and seeing the beaches and palm trees for the first time. Not bad for a bunch of young 20-something guys.
They're not the first young 20-something guys to enjoy that stuff about Florida. What was happening, or the last either, what was happening in pop music pre-Beatles? Who were the big acts, and how did those big acts either set the stage for the Beatles to continue on their path or create the conditions that the Beatles sort of went against?
Well, to your first question, what was happening, I would say not much. When you look at the British acts who tried to come over to the United States before the Beatles, who were they? They didn't exist. Cliff Richard and the Shadows, Sunk Like a Stone. Elvis Presley was making crappy movies and releasing, terrible, forgettable singles. Now you had wonderful soul singers like Sam Cooke, but even he died tragically in 1964. So there really was a huge vacuum. And there really wasn't anybody like him when you think about it. I mean, you had Buddy Holly and the Crickets. They were a collective. They performed Buddy's songs. So they were an influence. But remember, he died in 1959. So there was just this giant vacuum that it was almost as if it was waiting for the Beatles to arrive in America. And then, oh, by the way, after they kicked open the door, here come all the other British acts, the Stones, Dave Clark, Five, on and on and on.
Where was Florida politically and socially in 1964 and pre-Beatles?
It was a real potboiler. And I think that's what's so compelling about the Beatles' time in Florida. They've spent more time here in 1964 than anywhere else in North America. And of course, the civil rights struggle was going on at high heat temperature in St. Augustine. You had Dr. King crisscrossing Florida. He's in Orlando. He's in Tallahassee, having nonviolent sit-in workshops. He, of course, gets arrested in St. Augustine. He has to testify before a federal judge in Jacksonville. You had Malcolm X down in Miami whispering in Cassius Clay, soon-to-be world champion Muhammad Ali's ear. So and of course you had segregation. And the Beatles noticed that on their first visit. They noticed that the only Black people on Miami Beach were domestics or perhaps performers, bus drivers, that kind of thing. So Florida was really on the precipice of change, and the Beatles helped hasten that change.
America has always had opinions about Florida. I should say the rest of America has always had opinions about our lovely state of Florida that you and I both live in. What did America at that time in 1964 know and understand about Florida in the pre-Disney era?
Well, it's interesting. This part of the country was really more agrarian, wasn't it? And sure, you had kitschy roadside attractions, Gatorland. You had Tupperware home parties, which sort of was the Magic Kingdom before
And you've written a book
Disney.
about that too, right?
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. Now that you mention it, I have. And that's what I think is so compelling is I have found pre-Disney Central Florida, including in the Tampa Bay area also, to be this rich vein of history that people don't think exists. You had the beat writer Jack Kerouac living with his mom in Orlando in 1957 when this rock and roll book that he wrote on one 100-foot long roll of teletype paper was finally published by Viking and became On the Road. And he was the literary Elvis of the time, living in Orlando.
What do we know about why the Beatles chose Florida? Were you able to find an explanation as to why either them or their promoters put Florida so close to the top of their sojourn through America?
Well, the first time it was because Ed Sullivan had an existing relationship with the promoter down in what he called Miami Beach. And why not come down there when it's so miserable and cold up north? So, it made a lot of sense. And for the Beatles, it was like, great, this is going to be a holiday for us. And they just decide on a whim after that show on February 16th, 1964, Brian, I think we're going to stay the next week. And what I find so compelling is their bodyguard, who's this wonderful sergeant from the Miami Beach Police Department.
Oh, I've got questions about him. Don't
Buddy
give it all away
Dresner.
yet. But yeah.
Oh yeah, he's like right out of Central Casting. But the Beatles fell in love with Florida, and they had a lot of offers when the first tour of North America came around, and they had an offer back in Miami, but they chose the Gator Bowl. Brian chose the Gator Bowl, and that's why they came back in September of that year.
Right now in America, it feels like Florida gets the most attention of any other state. There are there is a very hefty portion of electoral votes that until very recently were very hard fought. It's almost as many electoral votes as New York, and as almost as many as Texas. And it was a swing state for decades, maybe not so much anymore, but there are two presidential candidates from Florida. Lots of people vacation in Florida. The population at this point is well over 20 million people. At that time, what role did Florida play in America's culture?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
I think it was really a transitional place, wasn't it? I mean, you had this idolized, some people would see it through rose-colored glasses. It was the place where the folks would come down from New Jersey and vacation. And in fact, that was one thing I found very entertaining about this woman that I interviewed. She and her family got bounced from their place they would stay during their annual trip from New Jersey to the Deauville so the Beatles could have their room. So this woman and her sister basically perched on chairs and looked out the doors the entire time they were in their room to see the comings and goings of the Beatles. So, I think Florida at that time was really in a time of transition. You had Jackie Gleason coming down and doing his show from Miami Beach. You had performers like Sinatra, Nat King Cole, some of the great jazz artists would play, the swanky hotels down there. But the middle of the state, Jacksonville, things like that, they weren't the tourism meccas yet. But one thing that I find so compelling is that Elvis came through Florida. like Johnny Appleseed in the late 50s.
I was just
And
told he
one,
actually performed here in Tampa, which is interesting.
oh,
Elvis
he played
Presley.
9 shows in Tampa.
Yeah, incredible.
Yeah, he played every one of his 4 tours from 55 to 57. He played the Homer Hesterly Armory.
Yeah, also the home of many wrestling shows, and also President Kennedy, who gave a speech there
Oh, yeah.
just a couple days before he died. What were your sources for this book? Just from reading it, you clearly got a lot of rich interviews during your reporting for this book. So you did interviews, and what else did you plumb in order to put this story together?
Well, that was one of the most satisfying aspects of this book. For me, journalism is about the journey, isn't it? And to talk to these people who had first person experiences with the Beatles was just amazing. So yeah, I was given access to this multi-hour interview with their bodyguard that his son had thought to do with his dad because it was so historic. But I also talked to numerous living folks like Larry Kane, who was the 21-year-old radio man in Miami who was assigned to cover this group, and he was none too thrilled about it. But by the end of his experience with the Beatles, he was buddies with John Lennon, and he just had some amazing stories. And I was also lucky enough to get into the Hard Rock collection, which at the time was in Orlando and had a number of letters from the Beatles, one from Paul McCartney, some original artwork that they gave to their bodyguard as a gift that they all signed. And he kept out on his back porch and sort of forgot about, and it got water stained. So I'm sitting here looking at this wonderful piece of art and thinking, oh yeah, buddy forgot to bring it in. That's what the stains are doing there, along with all the autographs of the Beatles. So that's pretty cool stuff. Musicians who toured with them, musicians who were just profoundly influenced by them as well. Bernie and Tom Ledden, Bernie being the founder of the Eagles. Tom was in Mudcrutch with Tom Petty, who of course grew up in Gainesville. There's this whole fraternity of musicians who went on to Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, who said the Beatles were like their North Stars.
Just as a side note, I met Larry Kane in, I think, 02 or 03. I was a student at Ithaca College, and he came up from Philly, where he was an anchor for decades, to give us his pointers on journalism, and he was a very nice guy. What is your first memory of the Beatles?
I am the youngest of 6 kids. And I was lucky enough to inherit all of my sister's original vinyl. So while the other kids are listening to bubblegum stuff, I mean, I can remember a wedding reception in suburban Pennsylvania somewhere, and my cousin Bill is driving his green Duster, and we're listening to Ringo's new single as a solo artist, "It Don't Come Easy." That's one of the first memories. So that's about 71. But I do remember even further back, like my siblings listening to Revolver. And I remember watching A Hard Day's Night. What a film to introduce you to this incredible music group like no other. So they're very vivid memories.
The hero of the book is Sergeant Buddy Dresner. Is it Dresner?
Dresner.
Dresner. Who was Sergeant Dresner, and what was he assigned to do?
Yeah, Buddy was this guy. I just love the vignette what he shared of finding out that he was going to be the bodyguard for the Beatles. He's the night sergeant, and the poor guy's sleeping like a vampire in his house, daytime. He's married, he's got 3 kids, and somebody comes knocking on his door, and he's not very happy about it. He rolls out of bed and swings the door open, and it's another officer. And they're like, okay, you need to go see the captain. You've been assigned to be the bodyguard for the Beatles. He was like, what the hell is Beatles? What are you talking about?
Right.
He
What's a
didn't know anything
Beatle?
about
What's
it.
a Beatle?
Yeah. And he ended up being their father figure, their big brother, their advisor, their protector. They could not have had a better person as their bodyguard. And I will tell you, the impression he made was so moving that, when he died in the early 2000s, Paul McCartney actually sent a hand-signed sympathy card to the family after all those years.
What does that say about him and the impression that he made on them as he accepted this quite surprise assignment?
Well, and Paul too, of all of them, Paul sometimes gets short shrift as the kind of winking, happy guy. Paul is very deep, and he's not afraid to speak his mind. And the fact that he did something nice for the Dresners many years after Buddy had been their bodyguard says a lot about him too. But Buddy had gotten to the point where the assignment was so demanding, he just gave up on the idea of leaving the hotel and going back home across the causeway, where he'd get to spend maybe 3 or 4 hours sleeping before he had to go back. So he says to George Harrison, "Well, George, you're getting a roommate." And he
That's
ends
incredible.
up being roomies with George, and they actually became quite close. George was the youngest Beatle at the time. He's only 20 years old, and he liked Buddy. They all did.
Another person you focus on is Kitty Oliver.
Mhm.
Who is she, and what does her experience growing up in Jacksonville illustrate about the South in 1964?
Yeah, Kitty was, lived in the poor section of very polarized downtown Jacksonville. And she heard the Beatles. And she also, what was crucial with her is she also saw pictures of them in fan magazines where they were like opening for Little Richard before they became overwhelmingly popular. And to her, it was very moving that they were so friendly with him. And their harmonies reminded her of some of the girl groups, African-American girl groups, and she was into them immediately. And she would listen to them at night on WAPE, the Big Ape radio in Jacksonville, which everybody remembers who grew up there. And she decided when she heard that they were coming that she was going to go. And it was, that stadium was in a zone of uncertainty, is what she called it, because it was segregated back then. But she just decided she was going to go, and that's what she did. And there had been some crucial court decisions that had been made, which paved the way for her to sit among the white fans. And that was quite revolutionary. And that was something that the Beatles had demanded. They would not have segregated seating at the Gator Bowl.
And before we get to the full Jacksonville story, I do want to point out they only played 2 shows in Florida, as best I could tell from the records that I looked at, which is Wikipedia records, right? I went to Wikipedia. Miami in February of 1964, and then Jacksonville in September of that year. So before we get to the Jacksonville part of this sojourn in America, I guess it was really 2 sojourns because I believe they went back in between, but what did the Beatles go through during those 6 or 7 months as they sort of adjust to the fact that they are now uber famous in America and Britain?
Yeah, think about it. They leave Miami after 8+ days. They immediately go into the studio. After that, they spend 6-8 weeks filming Hard Day's Night. They record the soundtrack record for the movie. Then they're immediately off to Australia and New Zealand touring there. Meanwhile, Brian is fielding all of these spectacular offers for their first proper North American tour, and it was a behemoth. So they didn't really have time like they did in Florida to chill out, spend time on the beach, and really get to know people, going to Buddy Dresner's house for dinner, for instance. So everything sort of exploded. Once they left Florida, they come back around on that tour starting in August in San Francisco. And Larry Kane is there covering it because he'd been invited to come along. And he goes, "Oh, wouldn't it be quaint to be out in the audience when the Beatles come out?" And he proceeds to get trampled by the fans trying to get close to the Beatles. And he said it was like, it was like a triage zone out there from kids who'd struggled with that, He really saw the sort of dangerous underbelly of Beatlemania too. So that's where everything really accelerated into 5th gear and didn't stop.
As we get into this momentous statement and stand that they make over the Jacksonville show. Just give us a brief primer here on what was happening in the American South in 1964 that is setting the stage for the Beatles to, forgive the Florida pun, draw a line in the sand.
Well, it was happening. It was the St. Augustine struggle. And in June of that year, Dr. King came down to be part of that and really to lend his star power, if you will, to what was going on there. He called St. Augustine one of the most racist cities, segregated cities in the country. And Andrew Young was there as well. And it was so dangerous that they would not let him lead the marches to the old slave market. And instead, Andrew Young did. And he told these frightening stories, frankly, of going down there and just being beaten. And it was a biracial demonstration, nonviolent demonstration. There were white demonstrators as well who were also getting beat up and brutalized. But one of the real heroes of the story is Judge Brian Simpson, who was the chief magistrate of federal court there in Jacksonville. And through the summer, setting the stage for the Beatles to arrive, they had the Civil Rights Act in 1964 that was signed by LBJ. And after that, as there were certain elements trying to defy that act in St. Augustine, it would always end up back in his court. And, he sided with the nonviolent protesters and scolded the state government all the way to the governor, saying, you need to protect these people. These thugs are coming in from out of the area and brutalizing these folks. And because he had so many important rulings, he paved the way for the Gator Bowl to be desegregated, among many other more important things. It wasn't just about this concert, but he laid down the law. And he said, it would have been much easier for me just to sweep it all under the rug. I mean, he got threats. He lost friends because he wanted to make sure that the new Civil Rights Act was enforced. And he threatened people with fines, jail time. And because of his courage, it set the precedent for a lot of things to happen, including the Kitty Olivers of the world, to go and see the Beatles and sit right there like any other fan.
How did Black artists impact the Beatles' development as musicians?
Profoundly. You can't tell the story without, Little Richard, for instance, Long Tall Sally, Chuck Berry. If you look at the photo I have in the book of the touring group, it looks very much like America looks today. You had the female vocal group, the Exciters, some of whom were just teenagers. And I was lucky to interview Lillian Moss, who, talked about her up close experience with the Beatles and how fun loving they were. But when it came to taking a stand, they meant it and they would not budge. So I was lucky to have first person insight among people on the tour. They also had Clarence Frogman Henry from New Orleans, another African-American performer. And they were very prevalent in the Beatles' music, in their tours, and in their friendships.
What impact did their outsider status, meaning British and not American, have on their views of the race debate in America?
Well, Larry Kane was important as he covered the tour. And in Las Vegas, he asked Paul, what do you think about the possibility that, some of your shows could be segregated, like Jacksonville, Florida, for instance? And Paul was like, we've never played before segregated audiences, and we're not about to now. And he said, we just don't understand why, and you could use colored people back then, it was an accepted term. And he just said, we don't get it. In some places they seem to be treated like animals. And I wouldn't mind it if one was sitting next to me. It dumbfounded them. And I guess they were just young enough and naive enough not to realize how much they were putting at risk by taking this really important stand, which was their first American activism, which came here in Florida.
Yeah. So describe, so they're booked on this show in Jacksonville, and what do they learn about the conditions for the show and also the way things were done in the South? And how did they react and what did they say?
Oh yeah, there was a hurricane there. We forgot about.
Oh yeah, I did forget about the hurricane. I think that's
Actually, I was
a
just
future
joking,
question, but yeah.
But
No,
no,
there
you're
was
right.
there was a hurricane, wasn't there?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. I
Yeah,
was going to say, yeah.
it's amazing that the show ever went off when you consider all of this racial turmoil. Dr. King was actually arrested in St. Augustine. He was taken to Duval County in Jacksonville for safekeeping. And this judge I was telling you about, Brian Simpson, actually had him come testify. And one of the things I found so compelling is the Beatles, when they came to Jacksonville, had their press conference at the Hotel George Washington, right next door to the federal courthouse where Dr. King had testified just weeks before. So you have this nexus of the Beatles walking in Dr. King's footsteps right along Julia Street in Jacksonville, which was the name of John's mom. So it really, there was all of that going on. And then sure enough, here comes Hurricane Dora, and it's looking like it is absolutely going to devastate everything. And, the Beatles had played a show in Montreal, and there were death threats against Ringo because these anti-Semitic forces saw Ringo's nose and thought he was Jewish. I know how crazy that is. And they just decide, let's fly out of here tonight. Let's just go. Let's have some downtime. And Larry Kane is the one who suggests, hey, let's go to Key West. We can, have a little downtime there. Let's see what happens with this hurricane. Then we'll figure out if we can actually play the Gator Bowl. So that sets the stage for that historic concert.
And the Beatles say, we're not doing it. We're not going out there unless it's going to be an audience that is integrated.
Well, in the course of my research, that was the main question I wanted to find out is, did anyone actually actively try to keep the show segregated? And the answer is no. The one pushback I saw was an editorial in the Jacksonville newspaper that talked about, who are these people to come here and make all these demands? And they obviously were looking down their nose at the Beatles, but it wasn't an overtly pro segregation editorial either. There really wasn't that. And my conclusion was Judge Simpson had set so many precedents in the run up to the concert that people knew that they could face fines or jail time, the KKK thugs or whomever. And that just didn't materialize. And there was no pushback to there being a segregated show, as much fear as there was, like the Exciters, Lillian Moss telling me, we didn't know what to expect up in Jacksonville. And the only thing they had was a little bit of bad weather.
What was the experience like that night for Kitty? Obviously, she was profoundly impacted by not only their music, but then seeing them live.
Yeah, that took a real act of courage, didn't it? As someone who's a teenager, just to say, you know what, I'm just going to go alone. And that's what she did. She got her ticket right there at the box office, and she went out there and she sat right along with the white kids. And she said, nobody really noticed me. Nobody really acknowledged me. She said, I tried to make myself small. And when the Beatles came out, you really couldn't hear the music very well, but it was just such a spectacle that all the kids went nuts, and Kitty went nuts right along with them.
Yeah, right.
And she said after the show, it was only after that she ran into an African-American brother and sister outside the stadium, and they said, you went to this concert alone? And only then did she realize the gravity of what she'd done. So
what does that say about what does that say about the way the music itself brought people together, that these differences, never in the background, of course, but didn't play a starring role that night?
Oh yeah, when you think about it, Elvis, think of how African-American culture is just so part and parcel of what he did. That's All Right Hound Dog, all of these songs that he did, Tutti Frutti. He wouldn't have had his act had it not been for the blending of African American culture. A lot of people didn't realize that he was white when they heard him on the radio. And the Beatles too were so profoundly moved and influenced by blues artists, Rolling Stones too, for that matter. It says a lot about the fact of what an important factor music was in terms of erasing that line of black and white. And you can't overstate its importance.
Is there a discernible, did the stance the Beatles took make a discernible difference in the debate over race in the nation at large?
It's a good question. I think what it did do was put the word out to young people. And Larry Kane had a really good take on this. He said these young people who were attending the Beatles shows were the ones who, protested for women's rights. These are the ones who came out against Vietnam. And in that sense, the stand that the Beatles took showed that they were serious, and they demanded to be taken seriously for their social conscience as well as their music. And that's another revolutionary factor of them. Think about it. Before they came along, popular bands for teenagers really weren't taken seriously as cultural forces, but they sure were after. And that's another big part of the Beatles' legacy is, they showed the way for America's youth, not just musically.
Obviously, there are no perfect parallels, but let's get as close as possible. Take a megastar of today, i.e. Taylor Swift, Beyonce, Jay-Z, someone of that ilk. How would Florida react if an artist like that said, and would it be possible for an artist like that to say, I don't agree with some of the things being done in Florida, let's say with education or trans rights or gun rights. I don't like the stances that they're taking in Florida. I'm not playing there. Would that sort of a move be possible today? And would it ring the bell of the politicians who are in charge?
That's a really good question. I think a number of artists may just avoid the state rather than saying something overtly that we're not going to play here because of certain political climate. But I do think you could argue that a number of them avoid the state now as it is, arguably. But anytime you come out and make a statement like that, like the Beatles saying, we're not going to play to segregated audiences, you're taking a risk. Elvis didn't do it. They had a roped off colored section at the Homer Hester Lee Armory in Tampa in 1956 and 57, and it takes someone to take that stand and take that risk. And to their credit, the Beatles did that. And I think also Brian Epstein deserves credit for that, because I think he's the one who came up with that clause that they would not play before segregated audiences.
It's so interesting because I was at the Taylor Swift show, or one of the 3 shows that Taylor Swift did in Tampa about a month and a half ago. And there is a very prominent, very clearly pro-gay rights song, and the audience bopped and swayed to it, and they loved it, and they sang along to it. And I was sort of expecting some kind of a political statement to be made either by her or by somebody in the state of Florida saying, this was kind of an affront to the values that some of the leaders in our state have taken, without mentioning any names. But I was sort of expecting there to be a blowback, and there wasn't one. What does the lack of a blowback to that statement say about the state of politics, either in Florida or in pop culture right now?
Well, it's an interesting parallel, isn't it? Because the Beatles didn't have the blowback either that was expected. And by the way, I didn't know I was in the presence of a Swiftie, so I tip my my chapeau.
You are very much so.
It's funny. I was down presenting this book at the St. Pete Museum of History, which is a beautiful venue right there on the newly refurbished pier. And the director said, the first time Taylor Swift played was here in the food court on the pier, probably not that long ago. But
Yeah,
I
right.
just
Yeah,
think
she.
I think her fan base is came of age in the internet culture when you meet so many I don't know, cultural uh, controversies, right? Earlier in your childhood, because there is so much there via the internet. And it's hard to draw a parallel between that and what the Beatles did, just because you didn't have the proliferation of media. You had 3 TV networks, and you had rural comedies like the Beverly Hillbillies and Green Acres as your cultural North Stars. It's hard to draw a parallel between then and now, except the fact that the Beatles did take that stand at a time when it was more father knows best 1950s than it was the precipice of the women's rights anti-Vietnam 1960s. It's an interesting discussion point.
Does it hurt you that the Beatles performances ended in 1969? And honestly, like, I guess I'd always known that they didn't perform that long together, but I never quite realized it was only 5 years. I mean, look at it this way. Taylor Swift has been active for like 15 years, and she's like 33 or something like that. How much does that change the Beatles story that they didn't go on and on and on and on?
But when you think about it, they actually toured actively and, played club gigs from the early 60s, 62 even.
Yeah.
They were more of a European phenomenon, but they played a lot of live music. But yeah, you're right. I mean, they toured basically from 62 to 66, right? And then from 67 to 70, they didn't tour anymore because it was insane. But I will say, having the good fortune to have seen Paul McCartney a year ago this month was just magnificent. And here's a guy who's 80 and still has so much passion, and was up on stage for 2 hours and 45 minutes and played a half-hour sound check for some lucky contest winners in the heat before that. You really do get a pretty good dose of what Beatlemania was like back then.
I wish I remembered this before we started this interview, but I did an interview with somebody who is kind of a house musician at a restaurant in Tampa, kind of an upscale restaurant. And he was invited, and I just hope I'm getting the details right, because I did this story years ago, but he was invited sort of under the cloak of darkness to come perform with his band, like his jam band, for someone's graduation party.
Oh, I'll tell you.
And I don't
just
think
did an article on it.
Yeah, and I don't think he realized it was Paul McCartney until he got there, and there he was. And we had video of him performing on it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I just happened to write a piece on this recently, and it was for Paul's stepson.
Yeah. And so you met the same guy I did.
Yeah.
And where was it again?
Well, his stepson graduated from Rollins College here.
Right.
And he had, his mother is Paul's latest wife, I believe, third wife. And they had his graduation party at the Interlaken Country Club, a very, among the gentry.
I'm glad you're here. I never would have remembered this.
Yeah. And I don't remember his name, but he goes, yeah, we were up there playing. But he did know that McCartney was there.
Uh-huh.
But he did not expect McCartney to get up and jam with them, which he did. And he played like she was just 17 and all of that. And that's the great part about McCartney. I interviewed a pretty well-known producer over here, Tim Coons, who produced Backstreet Boys and that type of thing. But he goes, yeah, I was having drinks at the Four Seasons with my wife, and she's British. And for whatever reason, Paul McCartney was there. And we struck up a conversation and started drinking. And Paul was rather taken with my wife, who's British, and he wouldn't leave. And it's just to think one of the most world famous guys, you could still just hang out with him is pretty amazing. And in that sense, that's why even in the book, as I draw the book to a close, that's one of the analogies I make. The Beatlemania is still burning brightly here 6 decades on.
What was the coolest artifact that you encountered during your reporting for this book?
Yeah, there was some pretty cool ones. Probably the 4-page letter that Paul wrote to their bodyguard, Buddy Dresner, that it was from on hotel stationery from New Zealand. And he was, now we're talking June of 64. And he's like, yeah, we hope we see you in Jacksonville, Florida, where we're going to be playing in September, unless this Vietnam War thing
Gets in the way.
gets out of hand. But see, they were very, their worldview was pretty sophisticated early on for a bunch of young guys. That was cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. Is the Deauville Hotel still around? Can people still see it?
And that's a whole just travesty, what happened with that hotel, because I would argue that's one of the top 2 or 3 most important Beatle landmarks in North America. And even though it was a historic building on Miami Beach, because of a hurricane, because of an electrical fire that happened there and a bunch of court litigation, it ended up being basically demolished via neglect. And it was imploded about 6 months ago. And we had fought hard to try to save it. And the fact that we couldn't was an absolute tragedy. And I'll tell you, the only place now that's still around where you can say the Beatles slept here is this little cabana building that's been saved, that's still part of a timeshare in Key West.
What would a memorial to the Beatles' time in Florida, a monument, let's call it, to the Beatles' time in Florida look like if you could design it?
I would love it to be this cabana building where what happened was, I told you after this awful Montreal show, they just needed some downtime before Jacksonville. So they were able to stay at the Key Wester Resort for 2.5 days. Very eventful days, by the way, of jamming and swimming, and John having to go to Duval Street and shop for clothes because he was part of a photo shoot for Cosmo, where this young enterprising reporter by the name of Gloria Steinem was, yes, indeed. She was doing a story on the fact that they thought that John was the one Beatle who might have staying power after this whole thing goes away. So those days in Key West were important. And the little cabana is wonderful. I'd love to see it be a Florida heritage site, and I would gladly fight to do that.
Top 5 Beatles songs. Is that a possible question to answer, or is that like asking which child of yours is your favorite?
Well, I have a soft spot in my heart for the earlier stuff, for songs like If I Fell and In My Life. And the reason I say that is because in the last chapter of the book, I'm trying to, it's called Markers, and I'm trying to draw conclusions as to what they really meant to all of us. And as I looked on YouTube at those 2 songs, especially for like In My Life, a guy writes that, I played this song for my mom in the last 5 minutes of her life. And, If I Fell, somebody had written that, John, Paul, and George's harmonies take me to a place of peace and solitude, and those type of things. And they're just so impactful. I like The Two of Us, the little acoustic number that John and Paul did towards the end that's on Let It Be. I'm not necessarily a guy who likes the big overwrought day in the life kind of stuff. I'm more into like the Paperback Writer or And Your Bird Can Sing, some of that stuff. But I'd probably say In My Life is number 1. If I Fell, number 2. Can't Buy Me Love is another great song of theirs. And then it's tough to list them after that. Have you tried?
No, well, here's the thing. So I was going to bring this up. I am not necessarily a Beatles fan per se. Certainly not even close to the way my parents are. I mean, I've seen both of them choke up just from seeing like a rehearsal session or something, like on like a TV documentary. They truly have an emotional connection to them that I just don't have. How do you explain the fact that, as I told you over email, I still pretty much know every Beatles song by heart because it was always just around? What does that say
Yeah.
about the staying power of the Beatles?
Yeah, they are just such part and parcel of our culture from that time. And remember, we didn't have this saturation of so many places to get information. But I'll tell you, as you had talked about that impact, I flashed on Ed Sullivan's grandson, Rob Precht, who I interviewed, who said, he was standing there at the sound check at the Deauville, and he said, the songs they played just, he said that music is burned into my soul. And it just kind of shows, the impact, the time, the culture, where we were in America. It was kind of a time of innocence. Post Camelot, sure, which was awful. But then you had Beatlemania, and the country just seemed to rejoice again. And you had all of this fresh air music coming in from England. It was a great time until, of course, Vietnam, broke the nation in many pieces. And I think that's why there's a real fondness for that window in time. Let's say 64 to 67.
Why
It
did
was a
you
great time
dedicate
for music.
Why did you dedicate the book to Sergeant Louis Buddy Dresner?
Oh, just because he's really the glue when it comes right down to it. And even I got to tell you, there was so much what I call synchronicity in this book that made me think, okay, I'm on the right track. And let me give you one example. Talking about Buddy Dresner. Well, I was writing the book, and to let you know, as a news reporter, I covered the George Zimmerman trial, and I get a call at home, and it's Judge Deborah Nelson from that trial, and she goes, "I saw online that you were in the Hard Rock collection talking about the Beatles," and I said, "Yes, Your Honor, I am writing a book," and she goes, "Oh, well, first off, call me Debbie." I'm like, "Okay, Debbie."
Yeah.
She
Okay, Judge
proceeds to
Debbie.
tell me that as a girl, she lived next door to Buddy Dresner in Miami Beach. And she figured out that it was the Beatles coming to his house. And she actually got to share part of that historic first ever home cooked meal in America with the Beatles. The judge from the Trayvon Martin case.
Speaking of home cooked meals, how does your Beatles book fit in with your other books, which are about Elvis and Tupperware? That's the home cooked meal part. So how does this
Yeah,
all fit into the stories you've chosen to tell in this format?
Well, they're great pre-Disney stories, especially from the peninsula here. And my raison d'etre has always been to let people know that yes, Florida does have history and culture, and Florida's music history especially is amazing. And one part of the book we haven't covered a whole lot is their influence. And
I will tell you, I skipped over the questions in the interest of time. I've had such a good time hearing these answers that I didn't interrupt you. So go ahead. Yeah.
Oh yeah, well, no, yeah, there's no way you can boil down a whole book
Yeah.
to an hour. I feel your
Yeah.
pain. But when you talk about Tom Petty saying, "When I saw the Beatles on Sullivan, it's as if the world went from black and white to color." And he was one of about a dozen future rock and roll Hall of Famers growing up in Florida, just profoundly influenced by the Beatles. So in this book, it's innocence, influence, and activism. Those are the three stages of the books of the Beatles' time in 1964 Florida.
How did you alter your writing style to go from local TV news reporter to long form book writer?
It's interesting. It's not that much of a stretch. Initially, I kind of had more of a style for this book, and it wasn't well received. So I just went back to the old axiom of, write tight, get to the point, don't be too flowery, But I do like to add detail when I think it's important, like the sailor I interviewed who partied with the Beatles. And when he told me about hearing the Beatles for the first time out on a highway in Chicago, and he couldn't explain why, but he actually started doing donuts in the middle of the snow-driven
That was an awesome
highway.
detail in the book. I love that. Yeah.
Well, and then thank you. The synchronicity comes again, and he's like, "Hey, Bob, where do you live?" And I'm like, "Oh, I live in a little bedroom community called Longwood." And he goes, "Longwood? Oh, wow." Now remember, he's up in Chicago. He goes, "Yeah, Longwood. My sister lives in Longwood." I'm like, "Wow, that's really interesting, John." And he tells me the name of the street that she lives on, and I lived right around the corner from her. And it turned out her step grandson used to cut my grass. So again, it's this weird synchronicity stuff going on, you know? I think that's good mojo for the book.
All right. I don't want to get either of us into trouble here, but I do want to ask, what do you miss about local news? What do you miss about being a local news reporter?
Oh, the urgency, the immediacy. I was one of the first reporters on the ground at the Pulse tragedy, and to even as horrendous as it was, to have the privilege of seeing how the community there came together and refused to be, bitter and angry and say, woe is us. And instead, it was a real gut check for the city of Orlando on many levels. And to witness that as it unfolded at the very beginning, while it was awful and very trying, it was also something I'd never forget. And Florida is an amazing place to cover news. It's just, I've had my fill. It's time for somebody else to do it.
Isn't it interesting that if you were to ask me about moments that I remember as a local news reporter, and I still am one, and I love being one, I remember very clearly being at the Parkland shooting a few hours after it happened. And then the next day was the day it really started to sink into the community as to what happened. And I feel to this day, the images and the sounds of those people and their efforts to put their lives back together, I can still feel it. And it was tremendously inspirational, may not be the right word, but it was a tremendously revealing experience about what it all means to have a community and to be human and to be among one another going through a really difficult time.
Yeah. And I would say Pulse, Orlando, in some ways, I don't want to say grown up because that sounds kind of trite, but they really came together and they were tested in a way they never had before. There've been hurricanes, there've been some very trying events over the years, but nothing like Pulse, where it was just this tremendously horrific, unprovoked attack like that. And you just had members of the community, some of whom who'd even been wounded, who refused to be cynical and angry and just be constant victims. Instead, they came together to help each other out and to get, past that. And I thought it was just such an amazing legacy for those who'd been so deeply affected. And it was, as awful as it was a privilege to see that positive part of what happened too.
Never forget that local news reporters are really close to the stories and really close to the people who they're interviewing. And I always think about that. It's different from our wonderful colleagues at the network, but there's a certain relationship that you have with a community when you're not parachuting in and out.
You're writing the first draft of history.
Have you decided what's next for you? Are you going to do another book? Are you going to do a dodocumentary? What are you going to do?
I think possibly a documentary project, I think could be next, because there's a statement that could be made. And again, it's just opening people's eyes that it goes beyond this kind of silly Florida man stuff all the time. And there's a lot more interesting things to celebrate. And, that's where I want to go. And I also want to landmark that Beatles cabana down in Key West. It needs to be a Florida heritage site to commemorate the amazing travels they had here. Almost 2 weeks worth.
Cool as can be. Bob Kealing, the author of Good Day, Sunshine State, How the Beatles Rocked Florida. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Evan.
Check out the book and also check out his books on Elvis, Graham Parsons, and Tupperware. His Twitter feed is @Bob_Kealing. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @AxelBankHistory. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.